This story is called Feegbah, the enormous pumpkin. Now, Feegbah is a different sounding name. Feegbah. Can you say it? Feegbah. I'll bet you don't know anybody named Feegbah. It's an unusual sounding name because it's an African name. And that's where this story comes from. Once there was a pumpkin, and his name was Feegbah. And he was enormous. Can you show me enormous? Enormous. I see you moving your arms out to show how big, how large, how huge and humongous Feegbah was. But Feegbah didn't start out as an enormous pumpkin. Oh no. He started out as a tiny little flat white pumpkin seed. One day, the boy came out of his house and he went to the garden. He bent down and with his finger, he dug a hole in the dirt. And then he put that pumpkin seed, he pulled it out of his pocket and he put it in the hole. And then he covered it up. And then he got a bucket from the well. And with the gourd in the bucket, he scooped some water out of the bucket and gave that little pumpkin seed a drink. Grow, little pumpkin seed, I love you. Well, the next day, the boy came back and gave the pumpkin seed another drink. How you doing there, little pumpkin seed? And he talked to him, and sometimes he sang to him. La, 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 you're my pumpkin. Well, every day for a week, the boy visited that pumpkin seed, and he gave it a drink, and he talked to it, and he sang to it, and told it things. And after about a week, that little pumpkin seed was so grateful that pop, up sprouted a little pumpkin stem. And down into the ground went the little pumpkin roots. And the boy kept visiting the pumpkin and giving it a drink and talking to it and spending time with it. As the days went by, if weeds came up, he pulled the weeds up. Now that little pumpkin stem grew taller and taller until it fell over and began to grow along the ground. It was a pumpkin vine. Well, it grew all over the garden. After a while, the bugs and the critters began to come and check out the garden, but the boy shooed them away. He picked the bugs off the vines, and pretty soon, all along that pumpkin vine, great big pumpkin leaves began to sprout. And then in among the leaves, great pumpkin flowers like big orange trumpets began to grow. Now the bees began to visit those flowers. A bee would buzz into the flower and get himself all covered up with flower dust, pollen. And then he would back out, buzz, and go visit another flower, buzz. And in this way, the dust from different flowers got all mixed up. And behind every one of those big orange pumpkin flowers, a little tiny green pumpkin began to grow. Well, they grew and grew and grew. One little green pumpkin in particular grew bigger and bigger and bigger until at the end of the summer, that pumpkin was enormous. And it kept growing and growing until at the end of September, that enormous pumpkin turned yellow. And it kept growing and growing and growing until along about the end of September, that pumpkin turned orange. It was enormous. It was Feegbah. Now the boy was ready to eat some pumpkin. He had watched this pumpkin grow larger, and he began to wonder whether it might be ripe and ready to pick and cook and eat. So the next day, the boy came out to the garden. He was going to check and see if the pumpkin was ripe. So he took his thumb and his index finger and he put them together. And he bent down and he thumped that pumpkin. Thump! Ow! Said Feegbah. The boy said, that pumpkin doesn't sound quite right. I'll give it another day. So the boy went away and he came back the next day and he put his thumb and his index finger together and he bent down and he thumped that pumpkin again. Thump! Stop it, that hurts. Well, the boy said, better, but still not quite right. I'll come back tomorrow. So the boy went away and came back the next day. And he put his thumb and his index finger together. And he bent down and he thumped that pumpkin again. Thump! I told you not to do that, said Feegbah. And Feegbah was so mad that he began to rock back and forth right there in the garden. Well, the boy had never seen a pumpkin move. He stepped back to get away. And Feegbah kept rocking back and forth, faster and faster, rocking back and forth until the stem that attached Feegbah to the pumpkin vine broke. And Feegbah began to roll toward the boy. Thump-a-da, bump-a-da, bump-a-da, bump. And you can say those sounds and help Feegbah move. Thump-a-da, bump-a-da, bump-a-da, bump. Feegbah rolled toward the boy. Well, he stepped back some more. The boy stepped back and Feegbah kept coming. Thump-a-da, bump-a-da, bump-a-da, bump. The boy turned around and started to run. He ran out of the garden. He looked over his shoulder. The boy kept running and Feegbah kept coming. Thump-a-da, bump-a-da, bump-a-da, bump. Thump-a-da, bump-a-da, bump-a-da, bump. The boy ran away from Feegbah. He ran down the hill to the road. The boy kept running and Feegbah kept coming. Thump-a-da, bump-a-da, bump-a-da, bump. Thump-a-da, bump-a-da, bump-a-da, bump. Up ahead, the boy saw some trees. The boy called, Trees, step aside. Feegbah, the enormous pumpkin, is after me. So some of the trees stepped to one side. Some of the trees stepped to the other side. And the boy ran right through the middle. Well, the boy kept running and Feegbah kept coming. Thump-a-da, bump-a-da, bump-a-da, bump, thump-a-da, bump-a-da, whap! He hit those trees. Toothpicks. Well, the boy kept running and Feegbah kept coming. Thump-a-da, bump-a-da, bump-a-da, bump, thump-a-da, bump-a-da, bump-a-da, bump. Up ahead, the boy saw some pigs. He called, "Pigs, step aside. Feegbah, the enormous pumpkin, is after me." So some of the pigs went to one side, and some of the pigs went to the other side, and the boy went right through the middle. Well, the boy kept running, and Feegbah kept coming. Thump-a-da, bump-a-da, bump-a-da, bump, thump-a-da, bump-a-da, whack! Feegbah hit those pigs. Bacon. Well, the boy kept running, and Feegbah kept coming. Thump-a-da, bump-a-da, bump-a-da, bump, thump-a-da, bump-a-da, bump-a-da, bump. Up ahead, the boy saw some cattle. Big, strong African cattle. A kind of cow. Now, these cattle had great curved horns on their heads. Great heads to hold the horns. Great necks and shoulders to hold up the great heads. The boy saw those cattle and he cried, "Cattle, step aside. Feegbah, the enormous pumpkin, is after me." But those cattle said, "We ain't afraid of no pumpkin." And those cattle lined up shoulder to shoulder across the road. And they bent their great heads down until their long, curved, sharp horns almost touched the ground. Now the boy kept coming, and Feegbah kept coming. The boy ran toward the cattle. He looked behind him. Feegbah was coming. Thump-a-da, bump-a-da, bump-a-da, bump, thump-a-da, bump-a-da, bump-a-da, bump. The boy kept running, and Feegbah kept coming. The boy reached the cattle and ran around behind them. Feegbah kept coming. Thump-a-da, bump-a-da, bump-a-da, bump, thump-a-da, bump-a-da, whap! He hit those sharp horns and stuck fast. Now, the cattle flipped their great heads up into the air, and whoops, Feegbah slipped off their horns and went rolling and tumbling up and up, higher and higher into the sky. And then he stopped and began rolling and tumbling back down until, whap, he hit the ground. And he broke into two pieces, a smaller piece and a larger piece, with the seeds from the inside strode over the ground. Now, those seeds flew up into the nighttime sky, where they became the little lights that we see at night, the stars. The smaller piece of Feegbah flew up into the night sky and became that bigger light that we see at night, the moon. And that big piece of Feegbah flew up into the daytime sky and became that bright light that we see in the daytime, the sun. And that is the story of Feegbah, the enormous pumpkin. Now you may know other stories about how the sun, the moon, and the stars came to be in the sky. This story is just one story about how that might have happened. And you can decide which story you like best.